Welcome to the Deep Dive, where we unpack complex ideas to find those surprising nuggets of insight. Today, we're embarking on a truly fascinating journey, I think. One that asks us to fundamentally rethink something as universal as, well, language itself. We've received some really thought-provoking source material. It doesn't just challenge the traditional narrative of how writing began. It sort of reimagines it entirely.
Yeah, it's quite striking, actually. And what's fascinating here for me is how this deep dive prompts us to consider what's been lost, What happens when language becomes abstract, disconnected from its roots? And what might we gain or maybe rediscover when it's viewed as relational, ancestral, and deeply tied to the feminine? So our mission today is really to explore this alternative history of language, moving beyond that familiar story of, let's say, control and conquest.
Okay, so let's dive into this then. Our source material points out that the conventional story, the one we usually hear, often begins with these grand narratives, right? The Sumerians, the Egyptians, the Greeks.
With the cradles of civilization?
Exactly. Culture celebrated for birthing civilization through script.
Yeah.
And this account typically links writing with, progress, order, control.
Right, managing surpluses, establishing property, tracking populations, that kind of thing.
But the source asks us this really profound question. What if that's only part of the truth? Or maybe even a distortion?
And that leads us right to wonder, what if the very first marks weren't administrative tallies or
Right.
legal treaties? What if they were something far more intimate, more tender?
Tender. How so?
Well, the source suggests imagining marks made, say, in the dark, in silence, with breath held softly, or maybe stemming from the body's deep longing, like a hand pressed into ochre on a cave wall,
Wow.
or a circle drawn in ash, or even a mother's sound rocking a child. The core insight here, which is pretty surprising, is that writing might have begun not as a ledger, keeping track,
Mm-hmm.
but as an invocation, a call meant to bring something forth into being.
Ah, okay. Not just recording something that already exists.
Exactly. Rather than merely capture or contain it, it sort of stirs an ancestral memory, suggesting language might be remembered and held by the world itself, the way soil or rivers or the night keeps memory.
That idea of language as invocation,
Mm-hmm.
that's powerful. And this is where the material takes a really captivating turn, I think. It talks about these stone-born people.
Yes.
Their language wasn't written on parchment or clay, apparently, but carved directly into the world around them.
Right. Into the world itself.
Through things like cut marks, standing stones, lines etched in alignment with solstice shadows. And they even left hands pressed in red ochre against cave walls, which the source says wasn't about declaring I am, but more like, I was with you, I am still. What does the source really mean by that distinction? I was with you.
Well, that distinction is, I think, crucial because it flips our understanding of intent, doesn't it? Many scholars might look at those marks and see, proto-letters, early writing.
Right, the beginnings of an alphabet or something.
But the source argues they were much more than that. They were gestures of deep relation. Marks made to honor thought and offer it back to the land, the stars, the unseen.
Offer it back.
Yeah. The purpose wasn't to fix meaning in a static way, like pinning it down. It was to participate in it, to enter into relationship.
Okay.
So before we get to what we recognize as syntax or grammar, there were what the source calls sigils.
Sigils. Right.
Marks made with profound intent, dup care. And they were designed to subtly alter the fabric of what is.
Alter it. How?
Well, much like a spell is meant to be a shift in reality, not just a description of it.
Oh, okay. Like magic, almost.
In a sense, in many animist traditions, language isn't seen as separate from the world. It is the world. Breath is vibration, sound is spirit. A river's murmur could be a kind of sentence, a bird's call, punctuation. And from the perspective of what the source calls matrilineal memory, which is a way of knowing often passed down through female lines, emphasizing connections, cycles, words were seen as invitations, currents, not commands. The turning point, the source posits, was when we sort of forgot that words were meaning in motion, when we separated the mark from the body that made it, treating a sacred cave wall like, well, a blank tablet instead of a living mouth.
Wow. Okay, so we've explored this radical idea of language born from tenderness, relation, invocation. But then, as our source describes it, there was this profound shift, almost a rupture. How did language go from being this invocation to becoming a tool of inventory and control? The material calls it a deliberate break, where writing was taken.
Yeah, taken is a strong word they use.
What was once breath and presence apparently became an index, an inventory. The sigil flattened into just a symbol, the gesture pressed into a rigid grid.
Right, and this helps us understand the origins of systems we still, navigate every day. The source argues that in Sumer, for example, early marks, maybe they tracked offerings or moon cycles. They quickly morphed into tally marks, ledgers.
Ah, the practical stuff.
The practical stuff. Cuneiform, a foundational writing system, emerged directly from the demands of surplus and property. It solidified into bureaucracy, receipts, contracts, taxes.
Okay, makes sense.
And similarly, in Kemet, ancient Egypt, sacred glyphs, once used for really divine purposes, were pulled into court records, royal decrees.
So state power co-opting sacred language.
Essentially, yes. Drafting the language of the sacred into state service, the spell became an account, the invocation, a report. And breath, that living connection, transformed into just a tool. The scribe, who might have once been a conduit between worlds, became, well, a functionary.
Right.
An administrator.
Right, just doing a job.
Exactly. Writing became specialized, professionalized, a skill for the few, often male, and directly tied to power structures. And this is where, the source argues, patriarchy deepened its claim, codifying punishment through the state, with script becoming this powerful instrument of surveillance and control.
Control, yeah.
The source highlights this quite provocatively as a kind of capitalist hijack of language, even before capitalism as we know it existed.
Wow. That's a bold claim.
It is, but the argument is that it led to standardization, replication, authority, replacing the flowing spiral maybe with the rigid line. Grammar became policed. Spelling literally lost its spell, its power, its magic.
The etymology there. Interesting.
Right, and syntax began to march in lockstep with empire. We still see echoes of this today, don't we? When certain accents are shamed or fluency is measured only by how close you are to a colonizer's tongue.
Definitely.
But as the source beautifully puts it, something in us remembers.
Something in us remembers. I like that. That's a powerful analysis. So even after this described flattening, this enforced forgetting, our source says some things lingered, like ghosts curled into letters, feminine figures half buried beneath phonemes. The breath didn't vanish entirely.
Apparently not. It's particularly striking how ancient wisdom persists, according to this material.
What are some examples? What are these whispers?
Well, the source points to Aleph, for instance, the silent ox head at the threshold of sound in Hebrew, representing power and potential, awaiting.
Potential power.
Or in Sanskrit, akshara, a syllable that, by definition, cannot perish. It's seen as a force, a soul in motion.
Cannot perish. Wow.
And omega. We often see it as just the end, right? The end of the alphabet. But the source describes it as womb-shaped, an opening, a return, a softening back into the spiral.
Womb-shaped? I'd never thought of that.
Me neither. And the insight here is that our alphabets themselves, the very building blocks, hold these old geometries. Curves like hips, arcs like crescent moons, even labyrinths sort of coiled into letters. The spiral itself still turns in the ampersand, the and symbol.
The ampersand.
And beyond just the letters, the source reminds us of these powerful figures, whose names are often lost to those big imperial narratives, but who once held the thread. Figures like Ninhursag, the Mountain Mother, Sophia, embodied wisdom.
Okay.
Saraswati, the goddess of learning whose speech flows like water. And Sishat, the Egyptian goddess of record who measured time with stars and sacred geometry.
So goddesses of writing and knowing.
Exactly. Each reminds us that writing was once sacred, an offering, a way to witness and to join with the world, not just a colonizer's tool. The source asserts, quite strongly, the feminine never left the script. She only went quiet. Waiting.
Waiting for what?
Waiting for someone to remember how to read with reverence again.
Read with reverence. Okay. Given this really profound re-understanding, what would happen if we truly stopped demanding that language perform for power? Like the source asks, what if we stepped outside what it calls the factory walls of meaning and allowed language to be something wilder, more like its ancient relational origins?
Yeah, looking at the broader implications, the source argues that patriarchy teaches us to view time as this ladder, right? Something to climb and control.
Linear progress.
Linear progress. And capitalism relentlessly quantifies it. Time is money. Language in that paradigm becomes a tool for enforcement. Grammar as governance, semantics as surveillance.
Wow, semantics as surveillance.
Yeah. But the source suggests that before all this, language was body, pulse, rhythm. A murmur passed from breast to breath, from soil to sound. The first words were responses, maybe not declarations.
Responses, not declaration.
Okay, and this term the source uses, queer teleology. It's about resisting that linear, climax-driven view of time and purpose.
Queer teleology. Can you unpack that a little? Teleology is about purpose, right?
Right, teleology usually refers to the study of ends or purposes, the idea that things move towards a fixed goal. By adding queer, the source invites us to challenge that linearity, to allow language and time to linger, to loop back, to notice what emerges between moments.
Okay. Not just the end point.
Exactly. Honoring fragmentation, contradiction, it suggests the womb is recurrence, a portal, and that the spiral, not the straight line, is what keeps us whole. This path, it's not presented as utopian, but as ancestral and possible. And it begins, perhaps, with a refusal. A refusal to perform fluency for empire, to package our experiences neatly into metrics, or to just blindly obey a calendar that doesn't align with our own natural rhythms, our seasons. It invites us to sort of unmake the sentence as we know it, to unfurl time, and to write in a tongue that doesn't necessarily end, but rather becomes.
Imagine for a moment, like the source invites us, what it would feel like to live inside a language that didn't demand mastery, but really met you as you were. What are the potential, maybe practical implications of this writing otherwise in different areas of our lives, beyond the theory?
Yeah, that makes me consider how we interact with knowledge, with the world around us. The source suggests teaching, for instance, could fundamentally shift from prioritizing correctness above all else.
Right, like getting the grammar perfect.
Exactly, towards fostering coherence. Imagine allowing ideas to arrive wild whole, following the rhythm of seasons in learning, maybe, instead of rigid schedules. Allowing a child to repeat, to return to meaning, without being constantly corrected out of their unique voice.
So honoring their expression, not just enforcing a standard.
Precisely. Or think about activism, moving beyond just the official cadences, the logical arguments, speaking in chorus maybe, in memory, in incantation, fostering a sense of belonging, not just anger or opposition.
That sounds very different.
It does. And archives, too. They could transform from these cold rooms, full of inert documents, into living bodies, honoring spoken words, unpunctuated lines, making our stories feel truly rooted, not just like a footnote.
Rooted, not footnoted. I like that.
If we wrote otherwise, language could become an ecology, like a garden, tended and responsive, growing like moss, shaped by who we've been and who we've loved. This queer teleology, it offers a way of being that resists being tidied up into forward motion.
Resists being tidied up.
Yeah. It asks us to live by resonance rather than resolution, letting the story circle back, letting the meaning unfold unevenly. It encourages us to trust that. Well, maybe I don't need to understand this yet to know it belongs.
That takes a certain kind of faith, doesn't it?
It does. It promises that to speak and write this way would feel like a deep, full-bodied knowing that this is real, moving us toward belonging, toward return, where meaning doesn't have to close or be finalized, but only has to call us home.
Our deep dive today has really offered a profound reimagining of language. It's quite something, not as this rigid tool of control, but it's a living, breathing current, rooted in sacred memory and deep relationality.
Absolutely. And if we embrace this idea, this possibility of unwriting empire, as the source puts it, we remember that the tongue doesn't just tell stories, it births them. It carries breath, blood, the pulse of all that came before.
So what if the true power of language lies not in its ability to define and contain everything, but in its boundless capacity to invite, to resonate? What if, as our source suggests, we begin again? Not by starting over from scratch, but by spiraling, inward and outward, trusting the loop, the refrain, writing not for proof maybe, but for promise. Perhaps as the source leaves us thinking, you don't have to write for power. You can write for presence. You can write as spell, as love, as refusal.